Well, greetings from St. Louis University. My name is Dave Rice. I am in Student Financial Services, and this presentation will be on financial aid. Just some quick points about that, and just to kind of in way of introduction for myself, just know that I am a father of three and have managed to figure out how to get them through college. So these things we're getting ready to talk about are not theory to me. I will just say to you all, I have lived the dream with you in trying to figure this thing about how to pay for college out. So just some items to consider. Just when we think of financial aid, what are the goals of financial aid? And certainly with students just like yours, we want to make sure that we're rewarding them for their achievements. Things like their ACT scores, their GPA scores, other things like athletics or theater or music, different talents that they have. So certainly financial aid wants to reward those things. We also want to evaluate a family's ability to pay because, as we all know these days, budgets are finite. And so we're trying to find ways to distribute limited resources in an equitable manner. We also want to provide a balance of gift aid and self-help aid, the differences between the scholarships and grants that we don't have to repay or earn, balance with those things like loans or work study that we have to earn or repay. This is probably the most important screen that we'll look at through this entire presentation. Obviously looks pretty simple, but it can get to moving kind of fast sometimes. So when you're looking at award letters down the road, or you're just trying to understand what financial aid is, it is just these four things. Scholarships are the merit pieces of awards that reward our students for the things we just talked about, like ACT, GPA scores, or our athletics, different things like that. Those are the scholarships. Grants are based on need. We'll talk about the FAFSA in just a second. But those are pieces of financial aid that are based on need. We'll talk about three different kind of loan programs today. We'll talk about federal student loans, federal parent loans, and private student loans. And we'll also talk about employment opportunities. There's several different sources of financial aid. Aid comes from institutions, from the school itself, comes from our state government, from our federal government, and from several other sources, things like your employers or private scholarship providers. So several different sources of where aid comes from. St. Louis University last year awarded over $210 million to our students. 97% of our new students received aid. The aid that we awarded to those students can be renewed for up to 8 semesters, and our aid can be used at our study abroad programs. And I would just say this, our study abroad programs are awesome, and that aid will travel with your students to those sites. So how do we apply and how does this process get started? Many of you by now have already been through some of this process, so this will be a little bit of a review. But we start with the FAFSA, the Free Application for Federal Student Aid, the Federal Pell Grant application. That calculates, we fill out the FAFSA, it gives us back a student aid report, and off that we get the EFC number, the Expected Family Contribution number, that serves as an index for our students' need-based aid eligibility. We'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. I also like to mention the CSS profile. Where the FAFSA is free, the CSS profile is not. It is $25 for the first school that you send it to and $16 for every school after that. St. Louis University does not require that for our domestic students, but for our international students, we offer that as a way for them to also be able to apply for need-based scholarships. Probably about 400 schools across the country right now that use that, and I usually just like to make mention of it as a way of saying that is a legitimate application, especially in these days and times of things that can be a scam or something when people start asking you to pay for it. The FAFSA has undergone quite a few different facelifts here in the last few years that went mobile a couple of years ago. So now we can download it on our phones and fill out the FAFSA on our phones. But one of the things I would simply like to point out on this screen is up in the upper right-hand corner, there's a little magnifying glass, the little search tool, and that is very powerful. It's a great way to search different pieces of information. If you have questions about filling out the FAFSA, or most of you are probably past that process next year, but remember you had to have an FSA ID, a username and password for you as a parent and for your student. And where do you keep that information? And if next year you can't remember where you put that piece of information, if you go to that little search box, there's ways that you can unlock that FSA ID or find it again or reset it. So just remember that for next year. That can be really important as you come back to the FAFSA. This is just a drop-down screen of if you did forget that, if you put FSA ID into that search box, here's the drop-down screen you would see, and one of those little click on sites there, you can click on it. It would help you to unlock that FSA ID. For those of you that have had, you're kind of veterans to this process and you remember filling out the FAFSA back when it started in January. Remember, we would start filling it out in January. We were trying to use tax returns. We hadn't even filed yet until April. And a couple years ago now, they changed that process. So we actually start filling out the FAFSA in October, and we will use tax returns that we filed the previous April. Fancy term for that is prior tax year. But it's very important to always file as close to October 1st as you can, because many pieces of aid can be awarded on a first come, first served basis. So always apply as soon as you can, as close to October 1st. And it's important to remember that we will complete the FAFSA each year for the new award year. Since we can use taxes that we've already filed in the previous year, it makes it a lot easier to utilize the IRS data retrieval tool. That's a tool that will allow you to download your tax information right into the FAFSA, so it puts everything in the right place. It also serves to verify that that information is correct down the line if you are asked by your school to verify that information. If at all possible, I would encourage you to use that IRS data retrieval tool each time you complete the FAFSA. So what does the FAFSA do? We talked about it a little bit a second ago, but essentially the FAFSA is the application. It generates a student aid report, and on that report we get an EFC, an expected family contribution, and that serves as the index number that determines our students' need-based aid eligibility. And let me give you some points of reference. So that number can be anything from 0 to 999,000. From 0 to a little over 5,000 puts our students in federal Pell Grant range. This coming year, a federal Pell Grant maximum award is worth $6,345. So a student with a 0 EFC would qualify for that amount of money. And on a sliding scale of about every $100 increments, that goes down to a Pell Grant amount of a little over $600. So that's the first thing it does. It tells us if our student is eligible for a federal Pell Grant. The second thing it does is that information is fed to our states and determines whether a student is eligible for a need-based state grant. Here in the state of Missouri, the cutoff for that is an EFC of 12,000. I would just make mention, too, that state grants don't cross state lines. So if you're coming here to a Missouri school, if you're coming from out of state, those state grants won't cross state lines. But that's the second thing it does. The third thing it does is that EFC comes to the school, and the school will use that number as a means to determine your student's eligibility for their own need-based awards. And here at St. Louis University, depending on your student's merit-based award, your student, we can get up into the 20 and 30,000 EFC ranges and still possibly putting need-based grants on the table for our students. So that's what an EFC does. It just determines our students' eligibility for need-based aid. This is just a lot of times on the FAFSA, this is just another example of the drop-down menus that I said. Sometimes when we're filling out FAFSAs, we're trying to make sure that that need-based eligibility is accurate. We're concerned about what assets do we put on the FAFSA. And this is just a drop-down in that little search box on the FAFSA. I simply typed in assets, and it gave me the screen. It says, these are the assets we put on the FAFSA. These are the ones we don't. So again, I know sometimes people are anxious about that information, but that's how simple it can be to make sure that you put that correct information on the FAFSA. So some different types of aid. First, we'll start with federal aid. We talked about Pell Grants a second ago, and I showed you that it was really important to file your FAFSA as close to October 1st as you can, because many pieces of aid are first come, first serve. Pell Grants are not first come, first serve. That is an example. As long as you meet the criteria from an AFC standpoint to qualify for a Pell Grant, your student would receive that, and it would be portable at any school. But these other pieces of aid are awarded based on first come, first serve. So the second thing you see there is Supplemental Educational Opportunity Grant, or SEOG. Schools receive an allotment of funds from the federal government, and once those funds are gone, we have to award those based on need. So we usually can't even get out of the 0 EFC ranges, and those funds are gone. So the next thing we look at is who filed their FAFSA first. So again, as close to October 1st as you can is the best. Federal work study is another piece of aid. It is unlike the grants that we've been talking about in that will require your student to actually get a job on campus. It's very simple. We have a process that they'll follow to do that, but they actually do have to get a job. They earn money as they work it. That money is paid directly to them. They could choose to turn around and pay that back toward their balance, but it is actually paid directly to them as they earn it. And like I said, we'll also talk about 3 different loan programs today. But those are the federal pieces of aid. When we think about the federal student loans, and again, I said we will talk about 3 different loan programs. This is the federal student loan program. You see 2 different columns here, the subsidized loan and the unsubsidized loan. The subsidized loan is the loan the government will pay the interest on for your student while they're in school. So that's the subsidy. They're paying the interest on the loan for the students while they're in school. The unsubsidized loan interest would accrue while students are in school. So students can receive a maximum of $5,500 this first year, and of that $5,500, as much as $3,500 of that can be subsidized. So if they received a $3,500 subsidized loan, they would receive $2,000 of an unsubsidized loan, and I'll show you in a second how that eligibility is calculated. The loans have a federal origination fee of a little over 1%, and they have a fixed rate on these loans of 4.53%. They set a new rate on the loans each year, but for the life of this loan, the rate would be 4.53%. You also see some different rates for future amounts. So for second year, students can get up to $6,500, of which $4,500 can be subsidized, and then $7,500 third year, and again, fourth year, of which $5,500 can be subsidized. And used to be, I wouldn't talk very much about those future amounts, but those amounts are actually based on the number of credit hours your student has earned. And now with students taking a lot more credit hours in high school, it's possible that your student would come in with enough credit hour to actually be at the sophomore level even as they start. So that is based on increments of 30 credit hours. So if you have a student that comes in with more than 30 hours, or even let's say they come in with 15 credit hours to start, and then they take 15 credit hours in the fall, by the spring semester, they could have earned another $1,000 of federal loan eligibility. So those are questions as you start meeting with your financial aid people a little bit closer to starting of school. You want to get those questions answered. The other 2 loan programs I talked about were the federal parent loan program and the private student loan program. Let's talk differences between parent loans and student loans. One of the main differences that for students, when they borrow during in-school enrollment periods, those repayments can be deferred until after they're out of school. It's usually till 6 months after they drop below half-time. So full-time's 12 hours, half-time is 6 hours. So repayment for students doesn't usually start until 6 months after they're out of school. For parents, the federal parent loans will start 60 days after they're fully dispersed. So half will come in August for the fall semester, half in January for the spring semester. So typically those loans would go into repayment in February or March. You do have an option to defer repayment while students are in school. It's as simple as checking a box on the application. But that's one of the main differences between parent loans and student loans. The other difference between loans on this page and the loans that were the federal student loans is that we saw the federal student loans had a fixed amount the government said our students could borrow each year. It wasn't a credit qualifying loan, but the amount was set. The loans on this page, we can borrow up to what's called cost of attendance, which means we can cover not only the direct costs, but we can cover some of the indirect costs of education for the year. But now these loans are both credit qualifying loans. So for parents, for the federal parent loan, they have an origination fee of 4.248%. That's a federal origination fee. It's not a fee that pays to the school. It's kept by the federal government before they disperse the loan. And the fixed rate on the parent loans this year was 7.08%. The student loans, the private student loans, are also credit qualifying loans, and they would require a cosigner. It doesn't have to be a parent cosigner, but it would have to be a credit-worthy cosigner, and it usually is a parent that would cosign for that. They typically have variable interest rates, and when we calculate repayment on them, and we'll do that here in just a second, we usually estimate that those rates would be around 10%. Just in recent meetings with lenders here in the past few weeks, and they show us kind of the normal rates that most of our students are getting. Most of those are averaging around 9% right now. But for a loan that doesn't go into repayment while students are in school and then out into the future, we'll estimate them at around 10%. So those are the 3 different loan programs that we have access to. I think it's real important if we're going to think in terms of loans, probably in our culture these days, we think more in terms of how much is that per month as opposed to just how much can I borrow. So for the federal student loan program I showed you on that first screen, for every $10,000 our students borrow, the standard repayment terms on all the loans we'll talk about are 10 years. There's no prepayment penalty, so you can pay extra and pay them off early. But with thinking in terms of a standard 10-year repayment term on the federal student loans we looked at, they would be about $115 a month per $10,000 that your student borrows. For the federal parent loans we looked at on that last page, they would be about $120 a month per $10,000 that we borrow. And for the private student loans, if we estimate 10%, they would be about $132 a month per $10,000 that we borrow. And I'll bring that back to a real practical application toward the end of the presentation. But I think it's just important to have a perspective on if we borrow some money, how much is that a month? The federal government this year has been in the process of combining all of their federal student aid sites into one site. And that one site now is studentaid.gov. So there used to be a site for the FAFSA and a site for the loan processing pieces, and then a site for just general information on the federal aid process. So they pulled that all back into one site now. And makes it a little easier to find everything. So you see several different sections here. The page that's pulled up here is the in-school section. There's also a parent section. These would be the places you would go if you were going to do the federal parent loan. You would actually go right here. The application is right there, and you can process these all online. But just wanted to give you a couple different screenshots so that those things would look familiar when you start trying to use them. So other sources of financial aid, private businesses and scholarships, things we talked a little bit about. I have a screen print of some of the different big search engines that are out there for scholarships. I'll show you in just a second. Most of our students, though, bring scholarships in from local civic organizations. I would say this to you. The number one source of outside aid that students receive, the number one source of that comes from things that they receive information from their high school counselors. It's really important to follow the directions that they're receiving from their counselors. Most high schools now have a centralized scholarship suite that students can access, and their high school counselors are pointing them to that. I heard some really good advice this past year when we were out in high schools doing presentations, and the counselor said he recommends to his students that they spend one evening a week applying for private scholarships. And I would say, you know your student best, whatever the appropriate amount of time that you think is right, I would encourage that for your students. But it's important to know that many of those scholarship opportunities require recommendations from teachers or different folks at the school, and you don't want to run in the door at the last minute asking someone to write a recommendation letter. So it's important to start early, and really by the time we're here at this point in the year, it's not really early anymore. It's time to make sure they do any of the scholarships they're going to apply for. They need to be processing that right now. Other sources, churches can provide different scholarship opportunities, and certainly our employers many times provide some tuition benefit for our students. So those are just some extra sources besides the schools that provide different scholarship opportunities. Here's a screen that gives you some of the private scholarship searches. FastWeb is probably one of the bigger ones. Most of these are probably included in the process that your high school counselors are pushing out to your students, but these are just kind of serve as an example so you can see a few different searches that are possible for your students. Financial aid has so much jargon out there, but I like to give you just two pieces. We spoke of EFC a second ago, expected family contribution, and the second item I want to talk about is cost of attendance. I mentioned it a second ago when we were talking about both federal parent loans and the private student loans, and I said you could borrow up to cost of attendance. So this is what cost of attendance is. It's made up of the direct costs that you see on the right side of the screen there, things like tuition fees, room and board if your students are living on campus. But there are other pieces to paying for college than just the direct cost. Things like books and supplies, transportation, miscellaneous loan fees. And some people say, books and supplies, why are those not direct costs? But in many cases, in most cases these days, the bookstores are not actually part of the school. Here at St. Louis University, we use Barnes & Noble. But you also have the option to buy books online. And so the registrar's office provides online a listing of the classes and the books that go with those classes. So you also have the option of buying books from places like Amazon. So those are not necessarily direct billed cost. I would also say to you, the miscellaneous column, I've been joking with families a lot as I do these presentations. If you will know what I'm talking about, if you have older students and you've already taken them to college, that day you take them to college, you'll almost assuredly have to do a Walmart run. And when you go up to Walmart, miscellaneous is all that stuff that are in the shopping carts that those people have. It's like shower curtains and bath mats and things like that, but very real things that we need for our students to fill out their dorm rooms and things. And we have students, their dorm rooms look like they should be in a magazine. So, but a lot of different things to paying for school other than just those direct billed costs. But the cost of attendance represents the maximum amount of financial aid that our students can receive for any given academic year. This is just a visual of how that's used. I told you a second ago when we talked about subsidized loans that I would tell you how that eligibility is calculated. And this is just kind of visualization of that calculation. So let's imagine that column 1 is private 4-year schools, maybe the most expensive. Column 2, maybe our 4-year public schools, a little less expensive. And column 3 would be our community colleges, the least expensive of the 3 options. We see in the middle there that EFC, that expected family contribution, is the same at each of those types of schools. It's not different because the cost of this school was different. It is the same. So what we see there is the formula is cost of attendance minus EFC equals need. And as long as that resulting number is larger than $3,500 that we saw for the subsidized loan amount, that means the loan can be subsidized and the government will pay the interest on that for our students. If that number calculation is less than $3,500, then that means more of the loan would be unsubsidized. But that's just kind of a visualization of how some of that calculation is done. Award letters. This is probably where most of you are in the process right now. You've applied to many different schools possibly, and you're starting to receive award letters from those schools. So let's kind of just talk about some of the nuances of award letters a minute. I'll take you through, and we'll use this award letter from St. Louis University as an example of some of the pieces, but some of the things to keep in mind. Not all award letters are created equal. So let's imagine that you've received 2 award letters in the mail today, and as you open the one from School A, you notice that they have offered your student $60,000, and we're pretty excited about this $60,000 award letter. And when we open the award letter from School B, it's only $30,000. But as we look a little closer, remember what financial aid is. Remember the very first screen. The things on this award letter, they're made up of grants and scholarships and loans and work study. So as we look at this $60,000 award letter a little closer, we notice that of the $60,000, $45,000 of that was a federal parent loan. Not that we won't credit qualify for it, but it's not grants and scholarships, if you know what I mean. If we look at School B, of the $30,000, $25,000 of that were grants and scholarships, and $5,000 was a federal student loan. So just as you look at those award letters, it's hard to keep our eyes from going to the bottom and we get all excited about a big number. But it is very important to understand what makes up that number. So let's take a little closer look at different sections of an award letter and how to make sure we're understanding what we're seeing. So this is an example of an award letter from St. Louis University. And first thing we see up there at the top, we see very clearly things that are scholarships, grants, and remissions, things that are student loans, things that are work study. So we can separate out what kind of award we want to first definitely understand, scholarships and grants. And so those are the pieces that we don't have to repay. We see on there the federal subsidized loan and the unsubsidized loan. We don't believe that it's right to put parent loans on the award letters. Many schools do, and they can defend that. They have good reasons for that, but we do not put parent loans on the award letters. But most schools will put the federal student loan on there because your student needs to know whether they qualified for a subsidized loan. So you'll see that on most award letters. It's also important, though, to separate out work study because, again, that's a piece of aid that your student will actually have to get a job and they will have to earn that money as they work. Down in the next section, we see our estimated costs. And here for us, that represents the direct costs. So we see things like tuition and our general fees that each student pays. For our students that will be living on campus then too, we would also see a cost for room and board. That is kind of an average of what our dorms cost. There's several different choices and varying whether I have one single room, a double, different things like that. But that's kind of an average of what our dorms would be. And so it gives you an idea. These are the direct costs. And so we see how much aid we have and we see the direct cost, and it gives us a sense of where we stand as far as paying for school. Our award letter has a second page, and this second page up at the top has award messages. So each of the awards on the previous page are outlined with a message on this page. We see things like for our Dean Scholarship at the top there, we see it tells us that that is renewable for 8 consecutive full-time semesters, and it tells us that our students will need to maintain a 3.1 cumulative GPA to renew that award. Just so you know, this is my parent hat speaking to you now that we worry, oh my gosh, is my student going to lose this scholarship for second year? They will receive that scholarship based on their ACT and GPA scores coming in that first year. We measure cumulative GPA at the end of that first year. And if they're not making that required GPA, they do not lose that award for the second year. they would simply go on probation for that second year. At the end of the second year, if they're not making that GPA, they would lose it, but they would have a chance to appeal. Maybe there's been a life event, maybe something's happened, so they have a chance to appeal to retain that scholarship. But we see messages for their loans and for their other pieces of aid, their federal work study that tells them how to go about securing a job and those pieces. We also see on this one in the mandatory message section, this person was selected for the federal verification process. And so there's some required documents that they would need to submit, but it outlines those documents and tells them exactly what they would need to do. So the next steps are outlined so that they're very clear. Our third page actually just gives a little bit of additional information just about how aid works and just some of the pieces to the process. But that's an example of what you will see in award letters, and that things should be spelled out very clearly. You should not be having to wonder which of these is a grant or scholarship or loan. You should be able to understand that very clearly from the award letters. So just a couple more slides, and let's kind of slow this whole thing down. We've talked about a lot of different pieces to the aid process, but let's talk very, very common sense right now. So let's imagine that no matter what school you're looking at, no matter what the cost is, you're going to have these pieces. You're going to have cost, tuition, fees, the kind of things we saw in that cost section a minute ago. You're going to have financial aid. And for right now, let's call financial aid grants and scholarships, things we don't have to repay. And let's also include our federal student loan. Oftentimes we try to make sure that our students don't have to borrow, but many times they need to. So we've got cost minus financial aid. Not a lot of decisions so far. We obviously want any of the grants and scholarships, the free money. We can decide if we're doing our federal student loan, but not a lot of decisions up there. Where the decisions come are when we take the cost and we subtract the aid, and when there's a balance, that's where the decision point comes. And we may think as a family, wow, I bet there must be 1,000 different ways to cover that balance. And we're probably the only family that doesn't know the secret handshake or the password. They say there's millions and billions of dollars of aid out there, and we're probably the only people missing that. And I'm here to tell you, you're not. You're not going to miss anything. But there's 3 ways to cover that balance. You can do a payment plan with the school, you can do a federal parent loan, or you can do a private student loan. So in that first example, payment plans, let's imagine that when we did the math, cost minus aid, that the remaining balance, let's just say that it was $10,000. So if payment plans usually are split into about 5 payments each semester, and let's just say our $10,000 balance was for the whole year, so about $5,000 for fall, $5,000 for spring. So 5 payments would be about $1,000 a month. And for some of us, we just said, oh, cool, that fits our budget fine. And for others of us, that didn't work so well. So what are our other options? So if we did a federal parent loan, remember the monthly repayment schedule that I showed you? So if we needed to do a federal parent loan for $10,000, we would know that that was a monthly payment of about $120 a month. We saw that that's a payment that we could defer while our students are in school, or we could choose to go into repayment on that about 60 days after it's fully dispersed. So that's our second option. Our third option would be to defer that cost until after our student's out of school, and we could do a private student loan. We saw from the repayment schedule that would be about $132 a month per $10,000 borrowed, and that loan would be deferred, repayment of that would be deferred while our students are in school. So again, what is the best option for us? Well, it depends on our family budget, and then different options are best for different families. So again, if we have a balance, there's 3 options. We can do a payment plan with the school, we can do a parent loan, or we can do a private loan. Some of the time frame, if you guys remember the year you've kind of been through so far, back in August to December, you're kind of doing a lot of your applications for schools, admission applications. In October, you were getting your FSC IDs so you could complete and sign your FAFSA. You were also starting in October to fill out your FAFSA. November through March is kind of the peak time to start receiving award letters from school, and you're sifting through those and trying to understand exactly what each school is awarding you. May 1st is kind of the national cutoff date to get any deposits back from schools. If you've applied and paid deposits, May 1st is that last date to get that deposit back. So it also kind of represents the target date that's the day you kind of have to decide this is the school we're actually going to go to. The month of June is a big month for orientation. You'll actually go to the school, do orientation. For example, this presentation we're doing here, it works great to get a lot of information to a lot of people really quickly. But during orientation, you'll have a chance to sit down one-on-one with the counselor and look at the exact financial aid package for your student and all the options that you have for your family one-on-one, so it's specific to your family circumstances. Bills will start to go out in July. First payments are usually due in August. August will be here before we know it, and it will be time to start moving your students into the dorm. And if we parents are honest with ourselves, we take our baby, we move them into the dorm, and then we cry ourselves all the way back home because we just left our baby at college, right? But those are the timelines and the processes that we will be following. Here's some contact information for us. I urge you, if you have any questions, to make sure that you get in touch with our office. We are more than happy to answer any questions that you have and make sure that your family maximizes the aid options they have and finds the best pathway forward as you try to figure out how do we pay for college. Thank you very much for listening, and wish your students the very best luck in this application process. Thank you.